Natalie Bennett, leader of the Green Party, speaks to the University of Worcester journalism and politics students.
A little bit about me, so you don't have to sit there wondering. My accent comes from Australia originally, although I moved to Britain in '99. I'm unusual in politics in that my background, my first degree, is in agricultural science. And there are actually very few people with a science background in politics, which I think is a real problem. But when you put those two things together, the agricultural science and the Australianness, it does mean I'm probably the only British political leader who knows how to shear a sheep. The media's got very excited about that, which probably tells you more about the media than it does about me. And some of you might be interested to know that that is my background, the media. I started off as a journalist on small Australian country newspapers, and I finished up as editor of The Guardian Weekly, the international edition of The Guardian. But I kind of always knew that at some point I'd get out of journalism, much as I loved that career, because at some point you sort of think, I've reported so many horror stories, so many wars, so many famines in Africa, so much disaster, that instead of reporting it, I want to get in and change it. And that's really why I got into politics. But when I'm talking to groups of young people like you, there's a place where I think I really have to start. And that is very simply to say, on behalf of my generation, and I'm about to turn 50, I'm sorry. We've made a right mess of things. We've got very clearly in Britain now an economic crisis, a social crisis, an environmental crisis, and indeed a crisis in education. Economically, we've just been hearing reports on Radio 4 this morning, interviews. We're still talking about those too big to fail banks, and we really must do something about them. And this is 2016, 7 or 8 years after the financial crash. We're still doing that. Socially, 1 million visits to Trussell Trust food banks in a year. So many people struggling to keep food on the table, a roof over their head. People left with no money at all because they've been hit with benefit sanctions or they're working 0 hours contracts. Environmentally, well, I don't think you probably all know at least a bit about climate change, but the environmental crisis goes a long way beyond simply climate change. One of the things we've seen a big focus on recently is plastics. A figure came out a couple of weeks ago from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that by 2050 the weight of plastics in the ocean is likely to exceed the weight of fish. One of the issues that you might like to pick up and perhaps do something about is microbeads. In lots of cosmetics now, facial scrubs, body scrubs, toothpaste, there's little tiny bits of plastic. These are what's known as microbeads. They go straight through our sewage treatment systems, straight out into our rivers and oceans. And actually in America, over Christmas, they agreed to ban the microbead. Surprisingly enough, the Democrats and the Republicans got together and agreed on a ban on microbeads. Yet here in Britain we haven't got one of those. So if you'd like to pick up an issue and run with it, microbeads is a really good, manageable environmental issue to look at. And then of course there's the educational crisis. Now you probably all know that the Green Party believes in 0 university tuition fees. That's because we believe that education is a public good, and the cost for that should be paid from general progressive taxation that's far more progressive than it is now, not as a weight on your shoulders. And like so much else that's happening at the moment, the privatisation of the NHS, the state of our railways, so many other issues, it's a case that what we're doing now clearly isn't working.
What would you say is the biggest crisis person for you, and how would you go about solving it, really?
Oh, the biggest crisis. I think actually the political crisis is probably, because that's to get politics that's actually representative of the people, to get politicians who are representative of the people, to then change the decision making, change the way things are done. The obvious example of this is Westminster. There was a big celebration. We got to 29% female MPs. that's a long way off being representative, and that's before you even get to issues about people from black and ethnic minority communities, people with disabilities, people from poorer backgrounds. We have a huge crisis of political legitimacy. And I was talking about how mainstream politics is failing, but politics on the ground is getting more active. There's an excellent website called The Conversation, and there was a report there from the University of Birmingham a couple of weeks ago, and it was a graph of the level of political activity as reported in the media from 2010 to 2015, and it was a very steep upward curve. And the report was suggesting that the level of political activity is now back to the kind of what it was in the 70s or 60s. So people are getting more involved, getting engaged. I mean, I was with the student nurses marching on the bursary or bust march in January, and it was lovely actually, because these were mostly young women who never thought they'd do with politics. It wasn't on their radar. And they suddenly got thumped with loss of bursary and fees. And it won't even affect most of the women who organised this, because they'll have left before the change starts. But they got organised, got engaged, and organised a big march on the streets of London. And they kept sort of sidling up to me and going, "We've never done this before. Are we doing it right?" And I say, "There's 10,000 people behind you. You're doing absolutely fine." So that's a really good example of people getting engaged in politics. But we need to make our political decision making match the will of the people.
About your point about proportional representation, what would you say to those? What would you say to the cons of the system, whereby parties where the majority would consider to be are distasteful would be allowed to sort of gain a major foothold into the political system? What would you say to that?
I believe in democracy. I believe that the people should have a say, whatever the say is, whether I agree with it or not. But I think it's also worth saying, although I said we would have got 24 extra MPs, it's also worth saying that had we had a proportional representation election, the result would not have looked the same as this one did. Many people who didn't vote, who said, "Well, I'm in a safe seat for whatever, there's no point in voting," would have gone and voted. People, and I met lots of people who said, "I'd love to vote Green, but I feel like I can't." So, I'm quite confident the Green vote would have been significantly higher, but I don't think the UKIP vote would have been much higher at all. But ultimately, I trust the voters. I believe in democracy. That's where you have to be, I think. People did not vote for a Tory government. In fact, only 24% of eligible voters voted for the Tories. That's not a mandate for anything that they're doing. So one of the things that we're also working on, as well as all the economic, social and environmental issues, is political reform, calling for a fair, proportional electoral system. And there's a really good example from this campaign of something that's also really happening, a really exciting development in British politics. And that's the rise of the level of engagement, of people getting more and more engaged in politics, getting more and more active. Because the day after the general election, there was a 17-year-old member of the Youth Parliament called Owen Winter in Cornwall, and he started a petition. He was so fed up with the election result, he started a petition for electoral reform. And about 2 weeks later, he had 235,000 signatures on that petition. And actually I, with a lot of other political leaders, went to number 10 Downing Street to help deliver that petition. So I can actually thank Owen for giving Nigel Farage the chance to photobomb me. Don't know why Nigel Farage wanted to photobomb me, but life's like that. But Owen, with that petition, gave a real impetus. And in fact, I was with Owen again last week. He started a new organisation called Make Votes Count. He's still 17, I checked, and so I'm not sure if they'll have a vote in May, but he's very actively involved in the political process. So before I finish and go to questions, there's really one final message that I want to share to you. And this isn't a party political message. This is a message that very simply says that politics should be something that you do, not have done to you. Because politics is being done particularly to young people at the moment. You're being hammered from left, right and centre with fees, with 0 hours contracts, with low wages and insecure employment. And to change the way our society works, what you need to do is get involved and get engaged. Now, politics can mean standing for the local council, standing for Westminster, standing for Brussels. But politics also means simply things like, if there's something in the university you don't like how it works, start a campaign to change it. I make myself really popular when I go into schools and say that to the school pupils. Get involved, get engaged, say that's not right, I'm going to help people, I'm going to change things, do things differently. And that's really what we need to see happen. Now with social media, with all the tools at our disposal, it's possible to be a 17-year-old and start a petition and it just takes off. I think it's a huge shame when you think about the fact that you're now going to have The Guardian on one side and the Daily Mail, the Times, the Telegraph, the Express on the other side. It's even more imbalanced than it is now. And there is still a glamour attached to newspapers, something being in print. However, I think that's something that's going to fade pretty fast. And one of the things that I'm trying to talk to the BBC, talk to all news media outlets about is you'll know they do the paid newspaper roundup. It's a way you fill in many hours of television at almost no cost. The newspaper roundup should become the media roundup, and it should also include websites like The Conversation, The Canary is another interesting new one coming along. If you must, Guido Fawkes. There's lots of websites out there covering a broad political spectrum, and it would make sense for the media roundup to cover all of those. So that's going to happen at some stage, and perhaps this should be the impetus to make that happen. But it is a real problem, our ownership of our media, and the BBC should be, I very much believe in the idea of a public service broadcaster. And I understand that the BBC is under a massive amount of pressure at the moment with threats from government for the funding, etc. And that's why, again, I come back to a point I may have belaboured a little, but we need a great citizen journalism media, and we're going to have The Guardian, and then we're going to have the right-wing media, which has very slowly and rightly been dragged to an acknowledgement of the reality of climate change. In most cases, the Sunday Telegraph being a notable exception to that. The reality of what we're doing with energy policy, the failures of energy policy, the focus in certain of the right-wing media on we hate wind turbines, and yet actually if you look at the surveys, unsurprisingly the public, when you ask them would you prefer in your backyard fracking or wind turbines, unsurprisingly people say wind turbines, quite wisely I would say, and that's an objective view as well as my personal view. We've got a real problem with the whole way climate change, energy issues have been reported. And, of course, it's not helped by, and I am quoting David Cameron here, when you've got a Prime Minister talking about the green crap. There's a real problem there with our media. But actually, that's a much broader problem too. It's not just energy policy. I mean, the quality of our media reporting, the quality of media reporting of our politics, if you go back to the last couple of weeks of the general election, in fact, I think about the last question time, myself, the SNP rep and the Labour rep were desperately trying to get the discussion onto some of the issues of the election. And the chair and the Tories just wanted to talk about, well, what does it mean when we have a Labour SNP coalition running the government? They were guessing what the result was going to be. That was all they wanted to talk about, and of course that wasn't the result at all. So we've got a real problem with the quality of our media. But that's also, I think, a real opportunity for lots of people in this room, because we must do media much better. And there's a lot of new websites, a lot of new opportunities to get involved, and even just do it your own stuff. You write a really good report, put it on your own blog. These days with social media, it can go viral in the phrase and can be read by millions. So Sky is better than the BBC on climate change, which is horrifying. We need some real changes. It's in all of your hands.